I'm very glad to take part in this conference, but I need the PowerPoint presentation.
Ok. André, se você puder compartilhar, por favor.
Sim.
André is sharing.
Okay. I guess you can see now.
Yes. Okay. You have to move the slides each time?
Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Can you see the slides, Professor?
I can see, but again, I need to move to the beginning.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, but the next one. Okay. Okay. Good afternoon. I'm very glad to be part in this conference. I will talk about Islamist anti-Semitism. Before I start, I want to make a clear distinction between Islamist and Islamic. Okay. I am talking, when I speak about Islamist, I speak about radical movements that transformed Islam into a political ideology, ranging from the Muslim Brothers to ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Islamic Republic of Iran. I'm not talking about Islamic civilization as a whole, or Islamic culture as a whole, but the Islamist movements are a very important segment today of the Islamic political and cultural spectrum. Okay? This is not a marginal phenomenon. Now, Islamist anti-Semitism has three unique features which make it much more dangerous than other types of anti-Semitism today. First, it is much more virulent, violent than any other public expression of anti-Semitism in the world today. It is the most openly genocidal form of existing anti-Semitism, because Islamist speakers speak openly, without any hesitation or without any attempt to camouflage their intentions, about their aspiration to totally annihilate the Jews as a people. And third, it is probably the most widespread brand of anti-Semitism today in the world, and it unifies Islamists from a very broad range: Sunnis, Shi'is, violent organizations, terrorist organizations, but also non-violent organizations that still espouse anti-Semitism. Now, let me explain what I mean by Islamism. Islamism is a modern reaction today among many Muslims in the world to a very deep sense of crisis, of vulnerability or humiliation, which they feel by modern Western-dominated global culture. A sense of threat that they feel that this Western culture poses to Islamic identity. And therefore, Islamism is an ideology that seeks to restore the power and purity of Islam that Islam had enjoyed in the past, centuries ago. Sorry, there's noise around me. In order to encounter or confront Western modernity. So it is a modern ideology that wants to restore Islam to its power, to its glory, and to its what they believe unique identity or pure identity. Islamism is part of global fundamentalist phenomenon, and it has several important characteristics. First, these people believe that they have a monopoly over the truth. They are the only people who know who hold the truth. And therefore, it means that if they hold the truth, then every other religion, Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, is not simply wrong, but it is sinful, and even it is an enemy of the truth and enemy of the one true God. Because if I represent God, then anyone who opposes me opposes God. Islamist movements view the world and view history as a permanent battle that takes place everywhere in the world, and at all times. It is part of a great cosmic spiritual confrontation between the forces of God, which are the force of good, and the force of Satan, that are the force of evil. It's also part of a struggle inside the soul of every believer. And if the world is a battlefield, and if the personal or collective salvation of the Muslims or their damnation to hell is at stake here, then the opponent of Islamism or the opponent of Islam is not simply an unbeliever or infidel. The opponent is an enemy, and he should be treated as an enemy that is destroyed. Now, Islamism does not make any distinction between Zionism and Judaism. They regard the conflict Zionism and the conflict with Israel are major factors in the emergence of evolution of Islamic anti-Semitism, but it is not the cause of the rise of Islamic anti-Semitism. I will elaborate on it later. And as I mentioned, Islamists do not distinguish between Judaism and Zionism, because for them, Zionism is simply the practical manifestation of Judaism. And therefore, they regard all Jews all over the world as either Israeli emissaries or co-conspirators in the plot against Islam. And again, to give you an example, these are caricatures that are against Israel, okay? Anti-Zionist, anti-Israeli caricatures. But if you look at them, you will see that they use typical, traditional, I would say, or modern European symbols of anti-Semitism. Okay? The picture here on the right, this is a Jew, okay, it's an Israeli, but this is the Jew from, you can say, anti-Semitic caricatures. And from his beard comes the word Dawlat al-Irhab, or the state of terrorism. And this Jew here drinks blood. Again, Israeli here drinks blood, using the idea of the blood libel. And the blood is the blood of Arabs or Palestinians. So you can see here how anti-Zionist features are actually using anti-Semitic symbolism. Let me go back in history a little bit to explain the background of Islamism and the importance of and the role of anti-Semitism in Islamism. I mentioned Islamism is a modern phenomenon. It is a product of the crisis of modernity. But it combines pre-modern and modern characteristics. Modern Islamist anti-Semitism draws ideas, themes from the Quran and from early Islamic traditions, the Hadith, but it also draws a lot from modern Western anti-Semitism. And it created a mixture of both. Now, if you look historically, the Quran, which for Muslims believe is the eternal word of God, the Quran contains quite a few harsh passages against Jews because of the conflict which the Prophet Muhammad had with the Jewish tribes of Medina in the 7th century. At the same time, Islamic tradition in the past 1,000 years did not regard the Jews at all times, at all periods, as the direct continuity of the Jews of Medina. It did not hold all the Jews in the world responsible for the acts of the Jews in Medina. Or it did not see the Jews of Medina in the 7th century as the archetypes of Jews all over the world, something that Christianity did. At the same time, the Quran also included some verses that were more friendly toward the Jews. So the Quran has both anti-Jewish themes, but also more amicable themes toward Jews. The question is what you pick from the Quran, which element of the Quran you prefer to emphasize. The Quran is a text. If you look at the historical reality, for centuries, when Jews lived in the Middle East under Muslim rule, until the modern period, until the 19th century, Jews enjoyed greater tolerance under Muslims than they had enjoyed in Europe under Christianity. Because Jews were regarded by the Muslims as people of the book, Ahl al-Kitab. That is, people who are monotheistic and were given by God a divine book, the Bible or then the Christian scriptures. Therefore, Muslims treated Jews with tolerance, but tolerance does not mean equality. Tolerance means that Muslims were on top, they were the rulers, they showed generosity toward the Jews who were below them. At the same time, there was always some legal discrimination against Jews. Jews had to pay certain taxes that Muslims did not have to pay, and there were other legal restrictions. And there was always, you can say, some pressure, latent pressure on Jews to convert to Islam. Tolerance toward Jews and toward Christians was conditional on the Jewish and Christian acknowledgement of the superiority of Islam. If either Jews or Christians challenged the superiority of Islam, they were punishable by death. While this tolerance was pursued, there was also anti-Jewish literature developed in Islam, in Islamic history, and I will discuss it later, okay? At the same time, the anti-Judaism that existed in Islamic tradition, in Islamic history, was never as central, never as important or relentless as anti-Judaism was in Christian Europe until the modern period. And indeed, Jews under Muslim rule for centuries suffered much less persecution or forced conversions compared to Europe. The only exception to what I've said was Shia Iran, because Shia religion or Shia sect in Islam was always less tolerant toward minorities than Sunnis, the majority. Shia doctrine regards the Jews as ritually unclean, which means, for instance, that if a Jew touches food, a Muslim could not eat this food. If a Jew touches a glass of water, a Muslim could not drink from this glass. It had to be washed, cleansed, so the Muslims could use it. There was also in Iran pressure on Jews to convert to Islam. In the 17th century, there was forced mass conversions of Jews. About a third of the Jewish community converted to Islam under pressure. And in 1839, for instance, the entire Jewish community of the city of Mashhad was forced to convert to Islam or face death. Interestingly, these Jews of Mashhad remained crypto-Jews for a century, they led dual life, and they returned back to Judaism, open Judaism, only in 1936. Muslim tolerance began to erode and decline in the 19th century. As long as Muslims were powerful and self-confident, they were tolerant toward minorities. But in the 19th century, when Muslims felt threatened by European imperialism and by Western culture, they became much less tolerant toward minorities. Another important development in the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire gave, under European pressure, legal equality to Jews and Christians. For many Muslims, these measures were a surrender to Christian pressure. And also they saw it as a threat to the social order. Muslims at the time began to associate Jews and Christians with the European threat. And this growing sense of threat from the West and the association of the Jews and Christians with the West, plus economic crisis, led, for instance, to 2 large-scale massacres of Christians. In Damascus in 1860, about 5,000 people were massacred, and in Aleppo in 1854. Jews were not touched in these massacres because they were a smaller community and they were much more cautious. But we certainly see the erosion of tolerance. Now, we also see in the 19th century the beginning of modern anti-Semitism in the Middle East, first because of the influence of European anti-Semitism. Christian missionaries who come to the Middle East and build schools brought with them anti-Jewish ideas and themes from Europe. The first example, or the first case, was the 1840 Damascus blood libel, when a group of Jews were accused of killing a Christian monk and using his blood for ritual purposes. It became an international scandal, and eventually 2 of these Jews died in prison, but the others were released. The Damascus blood libel was invented by Christians, but gradually we see the adoption of these ideas also among Muslims. 1894 is another important date because it showed that it witnessed the translation of a German anti-Semitic tract by a ruling called Talmud Jude. It was translated to Arabic. This is the first, you can say, modern anti-Semitic tract published in the Arab world and began by Muslims to a Muslim audience. The turning point, again, here in in anti-Semitism was the First World War. In 1918, at the end of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire, the last great Muslim empire in history, collapsed. Almost the entire Middle East was now ruled by the British and the French, by Christian infidel powers. Tremendous humiliation for Muslims. 1917, the Balfour Declaration, the Jews or the Zionists received international legitimacy. 1924, the abolition of the Caliphate, the symbol of Muslim political unity. For many Muslims, the First World War was a trauma. The world has changed. They could not explain what happened. They could not explain why it happened. It led to, you can say, a psychological predicament because, again, the world is turned upside down. And such predicament then leads societies to be open to conspiracy theories. They need an explanation why it happened. And then sometimes they make connections. First, end of Ottoman Empire, Balfour Declaration, the Jews are responsible for our disaster. Now, why specifically target the Jews? Why not Christians? Even though modern anti-Semitism predated Zionism, certainly the worst trauma, I would say, or one of the most worst traumas, okay, and certainly one of the most problematic and painful manifestations of the modern Muslim crisis were the emergence of Israel or Zionism and the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 and Arab failure to defeat Israel. Why? Because according to Islamic tradition, Muslims should be on top. Islam must reign supreme. There's a saying in Arabic, I will say it in Arabic and I will translate to English. Al-Islam ya'lu wa la yu'la alayhi. Islam should be on top. Islam should reign supreme. Nothing can be above Islam. At the same time, Jews, according to Islamic belief, carry the wrath or anger of God upon them. It is called in the Quran al-maghdub alayhim. Because Jews had opposed the Prophet Muhammad, they were punished by God. They were destined to be humiliated and dispersed among the nations. As long as Jews were a minority under Muslim rule, everything was perfect. But the moment the Jews claimed to be a people, the moment the Jews claimed sovereignty, the moment the Jews established a state, they challenged the superiority of Islam. The Jews who were below, all of a sudden, appear more powerful than Muslims. They defeat Muslims. This is unacceptable. And in many ways, Israel's existence or Israel's successes were a daily reminder for Muslims of the failure of Islam in the modern period. How can it be that a group of miserable Jews were able to defeat us Muslims? One of the early manifestations of modern Islamist anti-Semitism was translations to Arabic of anti-Semitic books in Europe. I will elaborate on it. But one very important manifestation in 1938, Haj Amin al-Husseini, the leader of the Palestinian National Movement, gave a speech in the Arab Congress in Baludan, in Syria. Speech was called Islam and the Jews, in which he spoke about a battle that takes place between the Jews and Islam from the time of the Prophet Muhammad. The Jews were waging a war against Islam. And he says the war that the Jews are fighting us today in 1930s is exactly the same as the one they fought against the Prophet Muhammad. They use the same tactics and the same methods. The important point here is that the idea of a permanent war between Islam and Jews. What we see in the 19th century is a transfer from traditional anti-Judaism to modern anti-Semitism. They are not the same. Traditional anti-Judaism had anti-Jewish ideas, but again, as I mentioned, the picture was not one-dimensional. It was more complex. Modern anti-Semitism is a one-dimensional view of the Jews as totally evil, which is drawn from selective readings of the Muslim scriptures. In the past, there was more complex reading, but also from the West, and it has turned Jew hatred into a major theological construct of the modern Islamic ideology. That is, anti-Semitism is an important pillar of modern Islamist ideology. You cannot distinguish between the two. Let me here show you some differences between traditional anti-Judaism and modern anti-Semitism. Anti-Judaism, which existed in traditional Islam, was a certain, you could say, disdain toward the Jews and hostile attitude toward Judaism as a religion. It basically aimed to undermine the validity of the Jewish religion, to show that it contains contradictions, to show that Jews even violated their own religion, it was less logical than Islam. It also blamed the Jews for rejecting the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, okay, and for distorting and falsifying the scriptures, the Torah that Moses was given by God. It also accused Jews of immoral activities. Modern anti-Semitism is different. Of course, it wants to show that Judaism is a false religion. But first of all, it demonizes the Jews as an active threat to Islam. Judaism as a religion, the Jews as a people, are a threat to Islam. It uses conspiracy theories. It uses terminology borrowed from European anti-Semitism, including the worst types of European anti-Semitism. And similar to medieval Christianity, it regards all Jews at all times as diabolic. And there is nothing positive about Jews. A very crucial theme of modern anti-Semitism, Islamist anti-Semitism, Jews, I will now discuss some of the features, is the association of the Jews with the West, with the threat of the West. Jews have become a very popular target of Islamist attacks or polemics, not because they appeal to Muslims, like Western culture. Western culture is a threat because it is appealing to young Muslims. But because Judaism and Jews are associated with the threatening West. They're associated with modernity. They are associated with the dichotomy between Islam and the West. Like many other modern anti-Western ideologies, from the Slavophiles in Russia in 19th century to 19th century populism in the United States, Islamism views the Jews as the carriers of universalist viruses. The Jews are the carriers of capitalism, of liberalism, and of what they call of ruthless cosmopolitanism. In a way, the Jews represent Western culture at its worst. Again, as I mentioned, Islamists view the Jews and the West as completely intertwined. Ayatollah Khomeini, the leader of Iran, for instance, in his most important ideological book, political book, explains on the first page of his book that Islam suffered from the Jews from the beginning, and that the Jews had been waging a war against Islam from its inception. They wanted to prevent the Prophet Muhammad from fulfilling his divine mission. But, he said, in the modern period, Islam faces a dual conspiracy or a dual threat by the Jews and the West who fight Islam. Why do the Jews and the West fight Islam? Because they understand that Islam, thanks to its ideals and laws, is the greatest obstacle to their desires to dominate the world. In addition, the West, which is again composed of Jews and Christians, resist the righteous cause of Islam to spread all over the world. So they prevent Islam from fulfilling its divine mission or divine destiny. In many ways, the Jews are seen to be the epitome of the West. They represent the most problematic, frustrating, frightening aspects of Western-dominated modernity. And to give you an example, an Egyptian cleric, Ala Said, in a television sermon in 2009, described the Jews as being behind the spreading of corruption and of calamities worldwide. He attributed to the Jews the responsibility for the spread of the bestial tendencies and lust that are evident in the modern age of progress, of enlightenment and development. And in his speech, he says, who did this? Who publicized it? Who supported it? Who was behind it? It was Freud, the Jew. Homosexuality, may God forgive me, who spread it? It was Jean-Paul Sartre, Freud and Sartre spread it, homosexuality. Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, the Jew, spread atheism. Karl Marx, the Jew, spreads atheism and materialism. So the Jews are responsible for the spreading of all these evil ideas that destroy Muslim morality, that destroy the Muslim family. And again, another theme is the Jews dominating the world. Again, I don't think there's much need to explain these caricatures. This portrayal of the Jews as carrying the worst features of Western modernity is contrasted with a deep sense of Muslim weakness, of being threatened by the West. And therefore, for instance, Jews are also associated with modernism. And you have here, for instance, a Saudi cleric, Abdullah bin Ni'ma, who attributed most of the more advanced technological inventions that are associated with modernity to the Jews. And he described these modern technologies as a Jewish conspiracy against Islam. And he explains, for instance, that WhatsApp is Jewish, Twitter is Jewish, Facebook is Jewish, Instagram is Jewish, Snapchat is Jewish, all the social networks are Jewish. And the Jews use all of these technologies in order to poison the hearts and minds of Muslims. And because of Jewish WhatsApp and Twitter, women's honor had been violated. Men divorced their women. Men and women have committed adultery. So the moral crisis of the Muslim world is the result of Jewish-inspired technology, of Jewish-inspired modernity. Another very important feature of all Islamist movements is the link between the past and the present. All religious movements regard the past as a source of inspiration, but this feature is much stronger among radical movements for whom the time of the Prophet Muhammad is the perfect age of Islam. All modern Islamist movements espouse the ideal of return to the spirit and purity of the time of the Prophet Muhammad. And therefore, what happened in the past served as a source of inspiration, as a source of lessons to the present, and especially here, the wars between the Prophet Muhammad and the Jews. More than that, the past serves as a model how to behave. And again, for them, the war between the conflict between the Prophet Muhammad and the Jews serves as a model which they should reenact in the modern period. Muhammad's struggle against the Jews is also a source of inspiration, because when the Prophet Muhammad began his mission, he was alone, he was weak, he was persecuted, but eventually he defeated all his enemies. Exactly the same thing will happen today. Yes, today we the Muslims are weaker than the West, are still maybe weaker than the Israelis. But just like the Prophet Muhammad, we will eventually be victorious. We will eventually dominate. More equally important, the way the Prophet Muhammad had dealt with the Jews is the way how we should deal with the Jews. And here we have two lessons. In one case, the Prophet expelled the Jews from Medina. With another Jewish tribe, the Prophet massacred all the Jewish men and all the Jewish women and children were sold to slavery. And Hamas says, and many Islamist movements say, this is exactly what we should do today to the Jews, when eventually we'll defeat them. What we also see here is how Islamism take past traditions, but amplify them. They resort to many anti-Jewish themes or words or tropes that existed in traditional Islamic texts and describe the Jews as deceitful, liars, bloodthirsty people, hateful people, money-loving people, conniving people, devious people, and the Jews are accused of falsifying both the historical and religious legacies of Islam and Judaism, but of course, the Jews are also accused of being hostile and enemies of Muslims. There's also another important theme today that blames the Jews or regard the Jews as the cause of all the disasters and problems that the Muslims face in the modern world. The Jews are responsible for what you can call Islamophobia in the West, and they are responsible for the bad image of Muslims in many parts of the world. Again, another important theme here is that the past and the present are conflated, are at the same time, are inseparable. For instance, many Islamic writers, when they speak about the struggle of the Prophet Muhammad, they use terms like Zionism. They say that when the Prophet Muhammad destroyed the Jewish tribes of Medina, he destroyed important Zionist bases. So Zionism goes back to the 7th century, and the struggle of the Jews in the 7th century continues to this day. The past and the present are the same. They're not separated. And of course, the past should serve as a source of inspiration for the present. And again, to give you an example, again, this scholar is a very popular, influential preacher, Muhammad al-Munajjid, who says, the Jews today are the Jews of the past. They are the same. And Allah made the Jewish traits or characteristics clear to us. And the Prophet Muhammad clarified that the war with the Jews will continue until the end of time. And you will see later what the punishment of the Jews should be at the end of time. Now, anti-Semitism all over the world, but especially Islamist anti-Semitism, relies a lot on conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are very popular in societies that are in crisis. Conspiracy theories define the danger that societies in crisis face. They bring rational order to the chaos that such societies face. They explain why we suffer. They explain why we are in predicament. Everything is a result of a plan, of a strategy, of conspiracy, of a powerful enemy. And conspiracy theories are very helpful to relieve groups and individuals from responsibility to their problems and from the pressure of reality. Because again, first of all, they provide explanation, and secondly, it is not our fault that we Muslims or Arabs in the Middle East are in such a bad situation, that we are, let's say, lagging behind other parts of the world. We are victims of powerful forces. So instead of looking and searching for the real, deep social, political, cultural problems that brought the Arab world to its very sad situation, you blame everything on the Jews, and then we Muslims are innocent, or we Arabs are innocent of our problem, of any mistake. Therefore, such conspiracy theories are very appealing. And the ultimate conspiracy theory, which became very popular in the modern Middle East, is the most popular, is the protocols of the Elders of Zion. The conspiracy theory is invented by the Russian secret police after the 1905 revolution, blamed the revolution on the Jews. Okay. The protocols are supposedly secret protocols of secret meetings of Jewish leaders who meet once a year in a cemetery at night in Paris, where they devise their plans to take over the world. The protocols came from Russia to Europe, to Western Europe in 1917 and became very popular. Already in the 1920s, there were 2 translations of the protocols to Arabic. But since then, they have become an extremely popular book in the Arab and Muslim world. Since 1920s, there have been over 59 printed editions of the protocols. Nowadays, they are spread all over the internet. And the protocols are quoted extensively by all Islamist movements and leaders all over the world. By the way, another popular conspiracy theory is the blood libel. Jews using blood of children and others. And if you want a modern translation of the blood libel, Israeli doctors pluck the eyes of Palestinian children and transplant them for wounded Israeli soldiers. Okay? By the way, when there was an earthquake in Haiti several years ago, a member of the German parliament, who was a Muslim, accused the Israeli doctors who were sent to help the people of Haiti that the Israeli doctors were not really helping the people of Haiti, but in fact were harvesting their organs and selling them in the black market. You can say a modern blood libel. Another important manifestation of again, both conspiracy theory and modern Islamist anti-Semitism is to describe the other, that is the people whom I dislike or hate, as Jews. Everyone that I don't like must be of Jewish origins. And you can see it, for instance, that since the outbreak of what was mistakenly called the Arab Spring, okay, in fact was an Arab upheaval in 2011, every political group in the Arab world accused its opponents of being Jewish or being of Jewish origins. Thus, for instance, all unpopular Arab leaders, from Gamal Abdel Nasser, who ruled Egypt from 1952 to 1970, Hosni Mubarak, Muammar Gaddafi, who ruled Libya, Bashar al-Assad, who ruled Syria, the Saudi royal family, and even the founder of the Muslim Brothers are described by their enemies as being Jewish. Even the anti-Semitic president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, former president of Iran, was accused by his opponents of being Jewish. And you can see here in this caricature, again, that the enemy is Jewish, or the Jews are the source of all our enemies. And again, I don't think there's need to explain this caricature. This is an Iranian caricature. Okay, it's self-explanatory. Another very important feature of the Jews, which has major ramifications, is the charge of Jewish corruption. The Jews are a corrupt people by their essence, by their nature. Again, this is a theme that existed in traditional Islamic anti-Judaism, but was given much greater amplification in modern times. Okay? The Quran speaks about the corruption of the Jews. The Quran says that the Jews were punished by God because of their corruption. There is a hint in the Quran about the second punishment of the Jews, which is in the future. What modern Islamists did was to take this theme of Jewish corruption and expand it and associate the Jews with, again, all manifestations of modern corruption. Again, to give an example, the Islamic Charter of Hamas, that's not the only one, explains that the Jews control all the drug and alcohol smuggling networks. They control Hollywood, of course. They control the spreading of pornography in order to spread corruption all over the world and destroy the moral fabric of all societies in the world. And again, here they quote a lot from the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Why is it so important? Because I can't. Sorry, there's a Jewish corruption serves as a justification for punishment. By the way, I should say, to give in the modern period, one of a leading Iranian cleric, Muhammad Taqi Misbah Yazdi, explains that all modern centers of corruption are Jewish and are dominated by the Jews. That is, Jews are responsible for corruption all over the world. And it is significant because, according to the Quran, the punishment of corruption is death. Can I want to move forward. This is not. Now, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I apologize. There was a mistake here and there. Let me explain. So when I spoke about the charges of all leaders are being Jewish. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Why is it so important? It is important for two reasons. One is the point which my late colleague Esther Webman described as the Jew as a metaphor of evil. That is, the moment I describe something as Jewish, everyone knows it is bad. You don't need to explain. Secondly, if I describe all the leaders of the Arab world today as Jewish or being of Jewish origins, unconsciously, I admit that we Arabs are totally dominated by the Jews. In fact, it's unconscious admission of the total, you can say, helplessness or incompetence of the Arabs. How can it be that the Jews control all the Arab countries? At the same time, if all the Arab leaders are in fact of Jewish origins, then all the troubles of the Arabs in the modern world are not their fault. They're fault of the Jews. So we Arabs are innocent of our economic, social, educational crisis. It's not our fault. It's the Jews who have done it to us. I should say, by the way, that this idea prevents Muslims and Arabs from addressing these problems. Instead of looking at how the ways to overcome their social, economic problems, if you blame someone else, you don't really address the problem. You don't do anything to solve the problem. Now, this is, I'm sorry, I didn't say it. I should have said it before. I apologize. And again, the idea is again that the Jews are the most corrupt people in the world. This is what I mentioned here. Again, Sisem Ayatollah said, the Jews are the most corrupt people in the world. You will not find any other nation in the world which is as corrupt as the Jews. The significance is that corruption is a sin in Islam that is punishable by death. In the Iranian penal system, criminal system, there is a clause which is called corruption on earth, which is spreading corruption on earth is a felony that requires the death sentence. So if I accuse the Jews of being corrupt, if I say that the Jews are the responsible for corruption in the world, it means that they deserve death. And indeed, this is the logical conclusion. Can I move? And I move forward. Now, like all anti-Semitism, all manifestations of modern anti-Semitism, Islamist anti-Semitism contains its own contradictions. For instance, Islamists deny the fact that the Jews are a people, that they are a nation, okay? They claim that there's no such thing as a Jewish people, but the Jews are a collection of religious communities that have nothing in common among them, except their religion. At the same time, they argue that the Jews all over the world and throughout history, all of them share exactly the same eternal characteristics and aspirations. That is, all the Jews all over the world have the same attributes, and all the Jews all over the world want to achieve one goal, which is to dominate the world. So on the other hand, they're not a people. There's nothing common among them, but they're all the same and have the same aspiration. Okay? Which is something doesn't work here. Okay? This is just one example. Of course, Jews are also responsible for capitalism and communism, etc. Another such contradiction, for instance, is, you can see it if I can move forward, is the attitudes toward the Holocaust. Two very important themes in Arab discourse on the Holocaust, or Islamist anti-Semitism on the Holocaust. On the one hand is denial of the Holocaust. The Holocaust never happened. It's a Jewish lie. It's a Jewish conspiracy to extract money from Germany. It's a Jewish conspiracy to gain international support. They claim that, again, either nothing happened at all, or this were not 6 million Jews, maybe 6,000, maybe 60,000 Jews. Okay, so on one hand, there was denial of the Holocaust. On the other hand, Islamist movements today are the only movements in the world, okay, that justify the Holocaust, that justify what Hitler had done to the Jews. Very often, they justify what Hitler had done to the Jews on three arguments. One is that the Jews, because they spread corruption all over the world, aroused the anger, animosity of societies among them, who then expelled them or punished them. And Hitler is the last ruler who simply expelled the Jews from Germany. Notice he didn't kill them, he simply expelled them. Okay, so what Hitler has done was not different from what the Jews suffered in Spain or in Portugal or in England and so on. Second, the Jews were responsible for Germany's defeat in the First World War. The Jews were responsible for the Versailles Treaty, and therefore when Hitler attacked the Jews, it was a justified revenge of what the Jews had done to the Germans. And the third reason is that Hitler took revenge on the Jews, you can say, as a prepayment for what the Jews have done to the Arabs, to the Palestinians. Okay? So there was no Holocaust, but Hitler was just in what he did to the Jews. And on one such approach, one such example, by the way, again, among many, is that following the September 11 terrorist attack in the United States, Sheikh Muhammad Jamia, who was the representative of Al-Azhar University, and Al-Azhar is the highest religious institution in the Muslim world. And Sheikh Jamia justified Hitler, okay, and he explained that had the Americans been aware of the extent of Jewish domination of their country, they would have done to the Jews what Hitler had done to them in the past. Okay? So again, you can see this contradiction. Now, finally, because of Jewish corruption, because of what the Jews have done to the Muslims, and because the Jews have rebelled against Islam and so on, the divine punishment, the deserving divine punishment of the Jews for for many Islamic speakers and writers is annihilation, making modern Islamism as the only mass movement today after the Holocaust, which openly and unequivocally calls for the elimination of an entire people. They don't use euphemisms like final solution or resettlement or anything of the like. They use the word of killing the Jews. According to this perception, the Jews, by insisting on having a state, by insisting on maintaining the state of Israel, by rejecting the idea that they should live as a minority under Islamic rule, are in fact waging a war against God. And because the Jews wage a war against God, they have lost their right to exist under Islamic law. And the only punishment which they deserve if they fight God is annihilation. To give you an example, several years ago, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah explained that God allowed Israel to exist and allowed the gathering of many Jews in the Holy Land so that it will be easier for the Muslims to exterminate them. And the prominent writer of the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood movement explained that first we will eliminate the Jews of Israel, and then the next phase will exterminate the Jews all over the world. And I can give you many other examples, similar examples. And the important point here is that the elimination of the Jews becomes a precondition or a manifestation of the redemption of humanity. Many Islamist movements endow messianic eschatological meaning to the elimination of the Jews. When they resort to a tradition that existed in traditional Islam, which is called the promise of the tree and the stone. Wa'ad al-shajar wal-hajar. And according to this tradition, the day of judgment will not come until the day the Muslims will fight the Jews and kill them all. And on that day, God will open the mouth of all the trees and stones. Now, the Jews will flee for the Muslims, okay? They will hide behind trees and behind rocks. On that day, God will open the mouth of the trees and the rocks, and they will say, "O Muslim, O slave of God, there's a Jew behind me, come and kill him." And according to this tradition, the world must be cleansed from the Jews before the coming of the hour, because of the end of time. And several years ago, a Hamas preacher who appeared on Hamas TV said, "Why do you think the Israelis plant so many trees in Palestine? They plant the trees in Palestine because they know that this tradition is true. They know that this is their fate. And that eventually we will kill them and they will have to hide behind trees, so they build the trees. They plant the trees." Now, to conclude, the problem is today that Islamist anti-Semitism enjoys wide reception because it draws themes and ideas from deeply rooted Islamic tradition, and therefore makes it difficult to challenge it. And because of the conflict, okay, and the predicament vis-a-vis Israel. It enjoys popularity because, again, the Muslim world is in a very deep social, political, cultural crisis. The problem is, again, that it serves the Muslims as an easy solution to avoid addressing their problems. Equally important, Islamist anti-Semitism is genuine. It is not simply manipulation. It stems from a deep conviction of those who espouse it, of those who write about it, or those who spread it, and of people who accept it. Therefore, it is much more difficult to fight against it than, let's say, if it was something that was pure manipulation. And finally, it is not only a threat to the Jews, okay, to us, the Jews, it is also, I would say, a problem for the world, and certainly a problem for Muslims themselves. Okay, I will stop now. I will leave time for questions if you have any.
Perfeito, então vamos lá. A gente tem algumas perguntas no chat. Deixa eu dar uma olhadinha aqui.
Você quer que eu leia, André? Já estou com elas
Ah.
aqui separado.
Por
Tá me
favor,
escutando?
estou te escutando, por favor.
Ah, então beleza. A primeira pergunta, professor, é da Milena, e ela pergunta: com toda essa documentação de incitações ao ódio, qual a saída aos judeus?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the question. I can hardly hear the translation. No, now I can hear. Yes, now. What they should do is to try to convince as far as possible that anti-Semitism is not only a problem of the Jews, it is a problem of many others. Usually, people start with the Jews and then they continue to others. You know, Al-Qaeda hated the Jews, but it killed Americans. It killed Europeans. It killed Muslims. Anti-Semitism is not only the problem of the Jews, it is a problem of others as well. If you don't stop it right now, when it confronts the Jews, you will face consequences in other societies. And again, I think it's essential to show that anti-Semitism is a threat for everyone, not only for the Jews. And that would have some effect. I'm not very optimistic, I have to say, but this may help.
So we have a next question, Professor, from Bruno Slack, and he asked, fundamentalism is a common characteristic of many groups, especially conservative religious groups. Two questions. How much of the Islamic world is fundamentalist? And the second, whether the Haredim and Datiim, Leumim, see the world as Islamic fundamentalists do.
Okay. How many Muslims support fundamentalism? It is difficult to say because most of these countries are not democratic, but I can give you some indications. 2 weeks ago, there were elections in Jordan. The Islamic Front received 40% of the vote. In the last democratic elections in Egypt took place in 2012. Islamic movements received 70% of the vote. In Turkey, President Erdogan has been in power in elections since 2003. He's been recently won the elections a year ago, and we see increasingly anti-Semitic terminology that he uses and his party uses. You can see in Iran, for instance, my guess is that about 30% of the population today supports fundamentalism. Again, we can see, so we're talking about large segments of society. I'm not saying that all Muslims are fundamentalists, not at all. but we are certainly speaking about maybe hundreds of millions of people all over the world. Now, in many ways, yes, the Haredim and the Datiim Leumim in Israel are fundamentalists, no question about it. Different types. The Datiim Leumim combines fundamentalism with nationalism, and they want to go back to the times of the Bible. And in a way, some of them see the fight between Israel and the Palestinians today as a continuation of the fight in the biblical times, forgetting there's difference in time. The Haredim are different type of fundamentalism. Again, their ideal past is the 18th century Jewish shtetl in Eastern Europe. One major difference between the Haredim and other types of Islamism, and believe me, I have no sympathy for the Haredim, is that they are very, I would say, scared of killing. Okay? They are not tolerant. They can sometimes use violence in their community, but for them, killing people is a taboo, something they totally oppose. Among some of, let's say, for instance, Jewish settlers in the West Bank and so on, they use violence. They use terminology which is harsh, which I'm very much critical of. Some of them have messianic ideas, okay, which are as crazy as the fundamentalists, Muslim fundamentalists. Fortunately, I think their share in society is not as big. Unfortunately, the political influence in Israel today is very strong. But endorsement of mass violence, endorsement of, I would say again, mass extermination is something that is unique to Islamist fundamentalism today in the world. You will not find it in, evangelist fundamentalism speak of, when God may destroy people, not that they will kill people.
Can I ask the next question, Professor?
Sure.
Primeiramente, quem manda essa questão, o Tiago, ele pede desculpas se ele não tem conhecimento sobre algum fato histórico relevante ao que ele pergunta. Vou começar a
Again,
falar
I can hardly
a
hear
questão.
you.
I think the translation is beginning now.
Yes, now I can hear you.
Tem-se relatos de que a convivência dos islâmicos com os judeus sefarade, Sabra e outros era, até certo ponto, pacífica e harmoniosa, e que o mesmo não aconteceu com os Askenazim, que imigraram em massa por ocasião da criação do Estado de Israel em 48, que apresentavam características estereotipicamente europeias, considerados representantes de uma cultura díspare e com práticas questionáveis, segundo os próprios islâmicos. Então, dentro da própria cultura islâmica, havia uma discriminação separando judeus sefarade e judeus askenazim, onde pode-se encontrar o ponto de convergência para que se retorne a essa convivência e os povos vivam em paz com suas culturas, religiões e modo de vida, encontrem.
Okay. Jews, you can say Sephardic Jews, Oriental Jews lived with Muslims. Yes, there was tolerance. Harmony is a little bit problematic because they were a small community and the Muslims were dominant and the Muslims were stronger and the Muslims could then were tolerant to Jews. But in 1870, when the Ottomans, for instance, declared conscription to the army in Baghdad, the Ottoman ruler sent soldiers to protect the Jewish community because he was afraid of anti-Jewish riots. Okay, so he knew that there was problem with the riots, with the harmony. Then, in the 20th century, in April 1941, there is what is called the Farhud. There's a pogrom against Jews in Baghdad. 200 people, about 200 people were killed by Muslims, by Arabs. Yes, you can say it's because of Zionism, but they killed Iraqi Jews who were not Zionists at the time, by the way. Okay. In 1945, there were pogrom against Jews in Libya. Okay. And also we had in Algeria. That is, Muslims became intolerant toward Jews in the 20th century because they associate the Jews with the West. And let me ask you a question. If there was such great harmony, why is it that when Algeria received independence in 1962, all the Jews of Algeria left Algeria and most of them went to France? Why didn't they stay in Algeria if there was such harmony between Oriental Jews, Sephardic Jews, and Muslims? Because there was no harmony. Because the Jews in Algeria preferred the French over the Muslims. And the same thing, by the way, happened to the Jews in Tunisia. Morocco was a little bit different. In Yemen, the Jews were discriminated against for centuries. They were persecuted in Yemen. This story of Jewish-Muslim harmony was ironically invented by the 19th century by Jewish scholars who wanted to criticize Europeans for being intolerant. And they portrayed an idealized picture of the Muslim world. I mentioned it, they enjoyed more tolerance than in Europe. Yes, there were no persecutions like in Europe. But because it was as long as Muslims were on top, Muslims were powerful, Jews were below, and Jews knew their place. The moment Jews do not know their place, the moment Jews appear to defy Islam, then tolerance disappears, and then animosity replaces tolerance. And it's not the issue because of the Ashkenazim. Okay, again, pogroms were against Jews in Baghdad, Yemen, Libya. It is a question of Muslim self-confidence and Muslim sense of threat.
Bom, acredito que essas foram as perguntas que a gente tinha recebido. E queria agradecer muito ao professor Meir Litvak pela conferência, agradecer ao público pelas perguntas e dizer que o nosso congresso continua. A nossa próxima mesa é às 4h30. É uma mesa que vai debater a questão do antissemitismo na América Latina no século XX. Então vai ser por esse mesmo link. Aguardamos vocês aqui e agradecer novamente e dar os parabéns para o professor Meir Litvak pela conferência excelente.
You're most welcome. My pleasure.